Welcome, everyone, to our last 3 weeks of the course on Gandhi and King, Soul Force and Social Change. We have had 7 weeks together, and now we have our last 3 sessions focused on Martin Luther King. We can have more next week and the week after, but this week, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, today, Thursday, our focus will be relating to Martin Luther King historically and his period of reform action, you might say, from 1954 to 1965. Tomorrow, Friday, we will look at King becoming more revolutionary in the last 2 years of his life, 1966, 1967, and of course he was assassinated April 4th, 1968. On Saturday, we will look at kind of wrapping up, if we can, the idea of soul force and social change for King in relation to the role of law. As we have seen, the role of law for King is very important. Many of his actions are designed to pressure governments to create a new law, enforce that law from the top down to bring about better changes to society. And then hopefully his thought is, as we've discussed before, that once new laws are being enforced, once, for example, it is illegal to lynch me or to execute me, as has been in the past experience for African Americans, once that is illegal, once that is stopped, then perhaps we can begin to learn to live together as brothers and sisters. So the role of law is coerce first and then convert later. Use power guided by love to create new laws that will be enforced. And then after that, coercive power has been used. Allow then for love to inspire the beloved community where we can become better in relationships with each other because the systematic discrimination, the systematic barriers and walls that have divided us have been brought down. That's his basic idea. Let us see how that played out in practice. Today, I will spend about 40 minutes discussing King the Reformer, beginning with Montgomery, Alabama, and we will see how far we go. We can go to Albany, Georgia, 1962, Birmingham, 1963. We can go to the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965. That all depends upon how much ground we can cover. And if you are interested in spending time in depth with Montgomery and the bus boycott, we can do that. It just means that we will have to either not cover the other things or just take our time and carry on with it tomorrow. So I will assess your desire before we leave today. After my 40 minutes or so, of course, we will have, again, chat rooms, small groups, so you can discuss with each other what you think about the information shared. And I will look forward to that happening. That should begin about 10 minutes to the hour, about 40 minutes from now. Okay? That's the plan. Is there anything anybody wants to say about the plan or anything you would like to discuss at all that we might take into account? I'm glad so many of you have been able to join us today. Well, very good. Always feel free to ask questions when they come to your mind. Always feel free to unmute and to explore something that is a little confusing to you. Okay? That is part of the learning process. And it is not showing disrespect for me or for my covering the material. In fact, it is a great sign of respect to show that you are really listening and have listened enough to be a little confused. And if you are a little confused, you can bet that other people are also confused. And when you ask a question, it benefits everyone. Okay? Okay. Well, Martin Luther King Jr., we know from our timeline. Okay, I don't see the slide yet, but it'll come. There we are. Thank you. You can, of course, screenshot this, and hopefully we will have a second slide before we finish this day, but we will do what we can do. You can see that the Montgomery bus boycott, which you can screenshot this piece that I typed up for you, began on December 1955 and ended December 1956. It lasted a little over 1 year. This was the beginning of the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement in the United States. It took place in Montgomery, Alabama, which had been segregated by law. The law required black and white people to be separated, segregated, living in different parts of the city. If they go to the same grocery store, one would enter through a white's door, the other would enter through a black door. They didn't even enter the supermarket or the grocery store the same way. Many restaurants were completely off limits entirely to black people. The city had 50,000 blacks and 70,000 white people. The boycott of the buses involved 17,000 people, almost all black. That was 3/4 of the ridership of the bus system. And it carried on for about a year. People carpooled, that is, they organized car transportation so that black people would not go on the buses. Eventually, they won victory in a district court case called Browder versus Gale, which was later upheld by the US Supreme Court, saying that segregation in public transportation in the United States is unconstitutional. Now, that's the very simple summary of the Montgomery bus boycott. And it doesn't tell you very much, but it gives you the basic facts, right? To understand the reality to some degree, it's important to understand the background where the bus boycott took place, what happened before. And the next paragraph could take too much time. I will simply go through it fairly fast, and then I will pause and ask if you have questions about that background. Because if we don't understand the background for a conflict, how can we understand the conflict itself very well? And how can we understand whether it was resolved in a very positive way? So, background. This is Racism in the United States 101 for Black people. For about 300 years, there was slavery in the United States. We didn't have a United States until 1776, but in the colonies, white people colonized the original 13 colonies, and slavery was dominant, especially in the southern United States, that depended upon it for agriculture. We know that there was a civil war in the United States from 1861 to 1865, 4 years of bloody conflict, where more people were killed in the United States, Americans were killed, than any other war in history for us. Over 2 million people were killed. The population was not very great. And that is 4 times greater than Americans who died in World War II. After the Civil War, there was a period called Reconstruction. Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans, the North, had won the Civil War. Slavery had been abolished by decree in 1863. And during the period of Reconstruction, the southern states were occupied by the military in an attempt to not only free the slaves, but also to bring them to a position of some equality and power. Reconstruction lasted, you see, until 1876. That was not a very long time, certainly not long enough for culture change. Many of you have heard the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. The KKK were a white supremacist group that rose greatly in the rural areas of the South and in some parts of the North after the election of 1876. We don't need to get into crazy detail, but let's just say that Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, ran against Samuel Tilden, a Democrat, for president in 1876. It was a very close election. There were 5 disputed states. Tilden agreed to not contest the results in those 5 states. Tilden, the Democrat, agreed to allow Hayes to become president on condition that Hayes ended military rule in the South. He would allow the southern states, the defeated states from the Confederacy, he would allow them to go back to rule themselves. Hayes agreed, and so the election of 1876 basically had the Republican Party of President Lincoln, who had freed the slaves, now agreeing to allow the South to do what they wanted after 11 years. Hayes would become president, and the military would no longer enforce rules protecting slaves or former slaves. The Ku Klux Klan grew dramatically. Lynchings and killings grew dramatically after 1876. Between 1876 and 1921, that period of about 50 years, over 4,000 Black people were executed, not by law, but by mobs. It was a period of terror, with the Ku Klux Klan doing what they wanted with no prosecutions to terrorize the Black community to submit to white rule. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1895, in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, ruled 8-1 that segregation was constitutional. It was acceptable. We can separate, that is, have apartheid based upon race, skin color in the United States, as long as it was, quote, separate but equal. That ruling was good law, as we will see, until 1954. What about the right to vote? Well, Black people, Black men at least, were given the right to vote in 1868 by constitutional amendment in the U.S. Constitution. However, in the South, particularly, there were many restrictions creatively made by people wanting white supremacy. So while theoretically Black people had the right to vote after 1868, and Black women, like all women, had the right to vote after 1920 in the United States, laws were passed in southern states to restrict the right to vote. One of these was called the Grandfather Clause. The idea was, you can vote if your grandfather could vote. Oh, your grandfather was a slave? Too bad, he couldn't vote, so neither can you. That was a very strange law enforced for many years, preventing even registering of Black people to vote. White primaries were used. In the United States, oftentimes there is a small election within the party, say the Democratic Party, to decide who the nominee of the party will be in the general election. Many southern states said, especially the Democrats said, only white people can vote in the primary to decide the nominee. Well, then oftentimes you had a white segregationist against a white segregationist for the nomination. No big surprise, a white segregationist would win the nomination, and the few Black people who could vote in the general election would have no choice. They would have to support either a Black segregationist or a Republican segregationist or a white Democrat segregationist. There were also things called literacy tests, where if you want to register to vote, you might go to your county in Mississippi, and you say, I want to register. You're a Black man. Yes, I'm a Black man. Well, tell me, what does Article 5, Section 3, subsection C of the U.S. Constitution say? No, you can't look it up. Tell me what it says. You don't know what it says? Well, you're not literate. We can't register to vote. They would ask questions for people at the registration, which almost no one could answer. They would ask Black people the questions. They would not ask white people the questions. The literacy test was kept one way of keeping Black people from registering to vote. So you can see, this is a setting. In 1954, when the Brown versus Board of Education case overruled the 1895 case and said, segregation is unconstitutional. We can discuss the Brown case if you want to. It was a 9-0 decision, which is very surprising, outlawing segregation in public education. That case occurred about a year before the bus boycott. Understand also that Rosa Parks, who was the one who began the bus boycott by refusing to give up her seat. Rosa Parks had attended a course on race relations in 1955, a few months before she decided to refuse to give up her seat. So Rosa Parks was not a spontaneous resistor. She had gone to a class which had helped to inform her about how nonviolent resistance could work. And so when she was given the opportunity to refuse to give up her seat and break the law, she did so. It was not just a spontaneous decision. It was something that she had been thinking about. Also understand that besides the Supreme Court decision and Rosa Parks having taken a course on nonviolence, there was an event, again, a few months before the bus boycott began. It was the case of Emmett Till. You can see this in that paragraph. Emmett Till was a young man, age 14, who was in the South and offended a white woman who knows what he said or did, but she complained. The local Ku Klux Klan in 1955 seized him from his house, took Emmett Till, strung him up by his neck, and then burned the body. It was an act of terror, which everyone in 1955 knew about, in part because the mother of Emmett Till took her son's body, took photographs of it, and went speaking nationwide about the death of her son and how this was wrong. No one was ever tried or convicted for the killing, but she was campaigning for the memory of her son. Well, a guest speaker came to Martin Luther King's church 4 days before the bus boycott began. This is not coincidence. You see, the small city of Montgomery, Alabama, had been suffering segregation for decades, tens of years. And the Supreme Court had signaled that there may be a change at the highest court of the United States in terms of segregation policy. Rosa Parks had prepared for nonviolence, and the burning of and killing of Emmett Till had made the community very, very angry and ready for resistance. In fact, 1 year before, in 1954, someone had refused to give up their seat on the segregated bus, and nothing had happened. They were arrested. No one complained. It just happened. Now, in 1955, December, Rosa Parks, when asked to give up her seat to a white man on the bus, said no. She was arrested, and this sparked the civil rights movement in the United States. That took maybe too much time, but I wanted to give you a context, and now I am going to pause. Or do you have any questions about this background? I went very fast. I'm looking for anyone to unmute if you want to and ask a question. While you were thinking, I want you to picture the buses in Montgomery, Alabama. It is a contracted bus system. It's for the public transportation. A private owner of the buses runs the buses. And by law in the city, the rule is black and white people can use the same bus. The law said white people begin seating at the front of the bus. Black people begin seating at the back of the bus. And as the bus fills up, black people come forward, white people go back. And at some point, if the bus is full, they meet. Yes? When they meet, if a black woman enters the bus, like Rosa Parks, and she sits down, and a white person enters the bus, there is no seat. The law says the black person has to give up their seat to the white person. That was the law, and Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat and was arrested. Do you understand the situation?
Yes.
Many people are living in extreme fear. Most of them black people cannot vote. They are living under extreme segregation, apartheid. All the police are white. All the politicians are white. The Ku Klux Klan terrorizes people whenever they want. Nobody can have justice if they are even killed by the Klan. All white juries in the courts will simply say, there is no case here. We find you not guilty of whatever it is. The system is controlled. This is the reality of this city of Montgomery, where Martin Luther King began his first ministry at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Shushil, you have your hand raised. Shushil, unmute if you like.
Yes, Michael. Good evening to you and good evening to all. Michael, just I want to know from where this idea of discrimination has been generated among the white people. Being a nation of it's a Christian nation, right? Then being a Christians, why this discrimination? Why they discriminated black people? From where they got this idea?
The roots are very deep, and I would argue unchristian. But among some of the Protestants who came to colonize the United States, the original colonies, many of them were believing in the story of Cain and Abel. In the Old Testament, one brother, Cain, murders his brother Abel. And according to the Bible, God says to Cain, you and your descendants, you and your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, shall be hewers of wood and drawers of water. He condemns the action of Cain. For some white Protestants, and this was true in South Africa as well as in the original United States, black people are the descendants of Cain. And they are descendants who are condemned to be hewers of wood, drawers of water. Effectively, if not slaves, they are to be disempowered, punished for the crime of Cain, killing his brother. That is some of the biblical root. Of course, the economic root of slavery and of discrimination is white colonialism in Africa. And with the cooperation, sadly, of many black African tribes who were fighting amongst themselves, who sold some of their defeated black brothers and sisters into slavery. Of course, the slave ships came over to the Americas, and these were property. They were not people. They were like a horse or a bullock, and they were to be used and bred and used to produce labor, primarily on farms, but also in other areas. They were bought and sold, just like a cow. So the roots were biblical, the roots were economic. And of course, eventually, many white people became very wealthy as a result of...
Adam was a black man or a white man?
Uh, I don't think that is perfectly clear in the Bible. The Bible itself doesn't talk about color very much. Jesus himself, of course, came from Palestine. He was probably dark skinned. He was certainly not white. Uh, so when you see an image of Jesus as being a white man, that is almost
Well,
certainly
most of the Hollywood
false.
movies, they show Jesus Christ as a white man. Most of the Hollywood movies. For example,
Yes.
Passion of the Christ.
So that's Hollywood. That's Bollywood.
Those
That's
those who are
Mollywood.
in power.
Are you going
Yeah.
to believe all of the movies?
Then why no one wants to show Jesus Christ as a black man?
Because of
The
white
black is a
supremacy. White supremacy, white colonizing powers. And here we're talking about, of course, the British, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, later a little bit of the Germans and the United States, Americans. They were all white. So they made Jesus in the image of themselves.
So in the bottom we can say those who are in power, they create and they create the law. They create everything.
They are, according to Marx, the ruling class who create
Yes.
the superstructure, the
Yes.
ideological framework that justifies their power. And I'm not a Marxist, but you can see that Marx makes a lot of sense. He does tell us something about this. And the origins of the United States of America were white, Protestant, male colonists who didn't all agree among themselves. They were of different Christian backgrounds, but they did agree that Jesus is white.
Michael, don't you think that
Slaves are black.
the
Yes.
whites have discriminated the black people on the basis of visual arts?
On the basis of what?
Visual arts.
Visual lots. Well, drawing of the straws. Yeah. Let's just say that white supremacy came to the United States, came to the Americas, took root, and has grown ever since. Donald Trump is still part of this white supremacist culture that is now about 500 years old in the United States. Very deep roots. And while black people were freed of slavery by the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, that only ended chain chattel slavery. They still became work slaves. They were sharecroppers. We discussed that before. The idea of you don't own your land, you have a white landlord, and you must pay the owner of the land a certain amount of what you create from your crops, sharecrop. And if you disagreed, there was the Ku Klux Klan to terrorize you. There were white police people to arrest you. There was a white political power structure in the South that you could not vote effectively to end. That is your situation. So, Rosa Parks, get up from your seat, give it to the white man. That is the law. It is December of 1955. Do it, Rosa Parks, or we will arrest you. She was arrested. And that began the bus boycott. That began the civil rights movement. Shushil, I hope I've given you some idea of what is a very sad history.
Yes,
It
Michael.
is very vindictive also.
The difference between the black and white. that originated from Abel and Cain. This is the first time, right?
Yes.
I'm listening that Cain was a black man and Abel was a white man. Am I right?
Well, let us just say the Bible doesn't say that. That is one interpretation of the story.
Yeah.
And it is a corrupt, in my opinion, false interpretation. But
Yeah.
it was useful to those who wanted white supremacy and colonialism. It was
But you
useful to the
see,
Afrikaner in South Africa, and it was useful to the southern white plantation owner in the United States.
But
Lubna.
that's all in
yeah,
New Testament. That's all in Old Testament, Michael. But the New Testament is something very different, right? And one
at
should
that time,
It only depends upon, you can argue this if you want. And I'm happy to. But the problem is among Christians, there are those who emphasize the Old Testament more, and there are those who emphasize the New Testament more. And there's a lot of disagreement among them. I'll just leave it at that because they do not agree. Again, there's a lot of different kinds of Christianity, and they do not all agree among themselves. I wish they were all like C.F. Andrews in India, but they're not. Many of them are like Jan Smuts in South Africa, or like George Wallace, governor of Alabama. So that is the reality. Now, King has just taken a new job, fresh out of his PhD program. He's at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. He's never lived there before. And that is an advantage. Because in 1955, the Black community in Montgomery, that was 50,000 strong, they were disagreed amongst themselves. The Montgomery Improvement Association, the MIA, was the organization that eventually organized and supported the boycott of the buses. Originally, the Montgomery Improvement Association had only 37 members out of 50,000 blacks. 37. And 20 of them were black ministers. And the black ministers were not all agreeing with each other. So if you want to get into the weeds a little bit, you can see that E.D. Nixon was the head of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the main political organization for black people in Montgomery. But Nixon did not get along very well with Ralph Abernathy, who was another Baptist minister and was still a very strong Republican. So Nixon and Abernathy, for example, they could not agree on who should lead the Montgomery Improvement Association. Who should be our leader? Well, it can't be you. Well, it can't be you. Well, how about him? No, we don't like him. We've known him too long. There are too many people. Everyone was canceling each other out in the black community. So who do they turn to? The new person moved to town, Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King is in the right place at the right time. People know that he's an outstanding speaker. He's a young man with a lot of energy. They don't know him well enough to dislike him. And so it's not that Martin Luther King was the best choice. He became the only choice in a very disunited black community. that wanted to support Rosa Parks and who decided to have a boycott of the buses. Martin Luther King, will you lead us? And Martin Luther King said yes. That's how he came to be the leader of the civil rights movement. It's not because he was the best or the most wonderful. It was because he was in the right place at the right time. I mean, he was very fine and he was wonderful. People could see that. But many people knew there would be a lot of danger. Whoever the leader of the organization is will be a target. They will be a target for the police. They will be a target for the Ku Klux Klan. It's a very dangerous situation to lead the boycott. In January 30th, 1956, do you notice January 30th, the day that Mohandas Gandhi was assassinated? Yes, just 7 years, 9 years earlier in India. On January 30th, 1956, the bus boycott was only 2 months old. Martin Luther King's house was bombed. Dynamite, explosions were thrown onto his front porch, blew away the front part of the house. Martin and his wife and his first child were in the house. They were in the back of the house. They were not killed. A crowd formed in front of the house, a very angry black crowd. How dare the Klan and others bomb our leader's house? Martin Luther King comes out onto what is left of his front porch. And here is perhaps a moment of kind of tremendous change. Because Martin calms the crowd. He says to the crowd, Jesus tells us that we are to love our enemies, bless those that curse us, pray for those that despitefully use us and persecute us. We must be able to turn the cheek. We must practice nonviolence. When Martin Luther King, from the front porch of his bombed out house, told the crowd to go home and be nonviolent, he spoke with credibility, didn't he? He showed the essence of his faith. And it was inspiring. What had been intended to terrorize the King family and the Black community turned out to energize the King family and the Black community. The bombing was a crucial turning point. A little later, Martin Luther King was arrested for engaging in the bus boycott. The charge was violating free enterprise. A very, very strange criminal charge. You're violating our philosophy that there should be no regulation of business, in this case, free enterprise, and that you should not be regulating the buses by refusing to ride on them. His arrest also energized the community, and it made national news. After King's arrest, a lot more people came down to Montgomery from the outside. As you can see, unlike Gandhi, King is willing to accept outside support, both people and money. And so a great many lawyers, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, lawyers, came down to help King in the bus boycott. There were two key organizers who came down from the peace group called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is, I'd mentioned it earlier, the oldest peace organization in the United States. The FOR is an ecumenical, non-denominational, multi-religious organization committed to nonviolence. They sent two organizers, Glenn Smiley, who was a white man, nonviolence trainer, and Bayard Rustin. Notice that I capitalized Bayard Rustin. From today, you certainly should know Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin is a black man who is homosexual. In the black community, that is, of course, not very good, but Bayard Rustin had earned the respect of others as an organizer, and he came to be a very close personal friend of Martin Luther King Jr. He was controversial only because sexually he preferred men rather than women. He was gay. But Bayard Rustin, as we will see, continues to be a part of King's life throughout the final years of King's life. And it was Bayard Rustin who was the main organizer of the March on Washington in 1963, where you have the I Have a Dream speech. That was Bayard Rustin organizing. He was a tremendous organizer, an incredibly pragmatic, detailed-oriented person who got things done and was committed to nonviolence. Please take a little time, if you like, to Google and otherwise find out about Bayard Rustin. There was also a movie made about Bayard Rustin called Rustin, which came out about 2 years ago, which is a fairly good movie. Okay, so the boycott continues until the U.S. Supreme Court rules in ordering a desegregation of the buses in Montgomery. After the Supreme Court ruled, the KKK fired gunshots at buses, so the black people didn't immediately go back because they were scared. King then returned to the buses 1 week later himself to get on the bus. Again, a very risky, dangerous thing to do. And he went on the bus with Glenn Smiley, the white man. So it was black and white together, integrating the buses of Montgomery. I can see that I need to wrap up, and we'll have to take more time on King the Reformer tomorrow. I can see that. I do want us to have time in chat rooms. But you can see basically more happened. After the bus boycott ended, King writes and publishes his first book, Stride Toward Freedom. He organizes a Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He is quite active, and while he was signing his new book in a bookstore, a black woman comes to get a signature, and she has a pen in her hand for him to sign, and a letter opener also, a kind of a knife-like thing to open letters. And the black woman stabs Martin Luther King very near his heart. King was almost killed by a black woman while he was signing his first book. If the weapon had been just a little bit, tiny little bit closer to his heart, he would have been dead. While he was recovering from that attack, he was invited by Nehru to come to India. And so in 1959, Martin Luther King travels to India for 6 weeks to learn more about Mahatma Gandhi. We can discuss that a little bit next class period if you want, as we will begin to get into page 2 of today's handout tomorrow. I think that's just the way time requires.